Oops. Hope you weren't thirsty. Yeah, you want to grab. Maybe you're baptizing your iPad or something. All right, well, grab some paper towels, but all right, so we've just sort of stated the problem. Again, I think this is one of those issues that, again, I think there's good answers to this. I think we're on good grounds to deny the conclusion on the basis of some reasons, but this takes a little working through. And again, I think I can put myself in the sort of atheist shoes and just sort of see why this bothers them in believing that there's an all-powerful God who's all good, given just the sheer amount and kinds and varieties of evils in the world. And this is the problem that William Rowe, that you will be reading for today if you haven't read already. He raises the evidential problem of evil. Now, his example doesn't go so well in Texas, it seems to me. It's his example about a baby deer that gets right. There's probably too many hunters in there. No, I don't know, but a lot of people, don't think that there are the same moral obligations with animal suffering and that sort of thing. But again, it's not hard to switch the example out to just imagine some horrific tragedy, natural disaster, let's say. So there's the free will defense doesn't, at least in one sense, doesn't figure in. And so on. That's where we're left with saying, well, do you think God has a justifying reason for the baby with brain cancer, right? Or the baby that dies? Think of it this way. This is why this is a much more powerful argument. If there's even just one instance of gratuitous evil in the world, then the argument goes through. I mean, it's a much more modest claim, which makes it much more powerful in a sense that it's harder to defeat. Because if there was even just one person in the tsunami, let's say, that doesn't, there's not some reason for their suffering, then gratuitous evil exists. Premise 2 is true. And if premise 1 is true, okay, so that's one thing to say here. Let's see, do I say this here? Okay, so one thing to say is now this is a different argument, so that premise 1 seems much more plausible than it did before, than in the logical problem of evil, I should say. To say that God's being all good, all powerful is inconsistent with the existence of gratuitous evil, that seems right. That's just to say God's not heaping the evil on. It would be God allows evil, sure, when he's got greater justifying reasons for that evil. But God couldn't just allow evil for no good reason at all. That would be inconsistent with his moral character. Right, so premise 1 now is far more plausible in this argument than it was in the last argument. So then typically the conversation revolves around premise 2, whether or not there's in fact gratuitous evil. Does that make sense? So that the one before was just saying that there's some evil in the world at all, and that's very, very plausible. Again, I don't recommend denying that, especially in counseling, right? But here to say that there's unjustified evil, that seems to be at least questionable. And that's exactly where we're headed. Okay. I have somehow skipped. Let me see what happened here. Did we do that? Because we didn't do response 1, did we? Here we go. I didn't miss anything up, did I, Chris? Okay. Okay, here's the argument. Response number 1. Now, none of us, I'm guessing, will like the name of this view. It's not a view that to walk out of here saying, man, I love skeptical theism. But it's the name that's stuck. So unfortunately, we're sort of stuck with this. We should all be skeptical theists when we're talking problem of evil. It doesn't mean you're skeptical about God's existence. It doesn't mean you're a skeptic of any real sort. It's just to say, the skeptical part is to say that we don't know why God allows what he allows. We're not in a position to have, in a way, access to God's reasons for everything that God allows to happen, everything that happens in the world. Okay? That's the skeptical part, is just to say that we sort of occupy this limited space, and we have this limited amount that we could even know, right? Even if we have access to it, it's still, we hit limits all the time. We exist on this tiny little slice in the overall, historical picture, in this tiny little specified location, right? And so when we're asked about a deer, we're asked about a tsunami, we're asked about whatever, the claim will be that we're simply not in a position to know God's justifying reasons, at least in, cases like that. Sometimes we might know God's reasons. I mean, sometimes Scripture tells us what God's reasons were for something or other. But for many, many things, maybe most things, maybe virtually everything, we really don't have access to what God's justifying reasons are. Okay, so this is to say, ultimately, that premise 2 is false in the sense that we'll say, well, we're not quite there to say premise is false, but despite what I have on the PowerPoint right now. Here's an example. So let's say you are, this is illustrating this, being in a position to know. Let's say you live at a house and, sort of, what do you call that? Well, there's a suburban home, sort of spec home, where your house is kind of right there. You're standing at the street, your garage door is open, and you're asked whether or not your car's in there. Garage door's open, you look in. You're in a position to know that, it seems to me. That's a big enough object. You've got a clear enough view. You could weigh in on that issue, right? But now if you're asked, is there a grasshopper in your, garage? And you're standing at the street looking into the open door. Well, you're simply not in a position to know because it's too small. You're not in this sort of privileged position to know in that case, especially if I'm thinking of my very full, chaotic garage right now, right? I'm sure I'm actually pretty confident that there are grasshoppers. But anyway, I wouldn't know, you know what I mean? Because I'm not in a position to know. It's too small. And that's how we are really when trying to know the intentions and plans and purposes of God. We are in way less of a position than we are in the garage case to know those things, because we just simply are not privy to what God's plans and purposes are in every little, every square of the universe and so on. So this is called the skeptical theist position. Just to point this out. And this has got another step to it. This is something that William Rowe talks about in his article, the G.E. Moore shift, which might sound kind of like a dance move, but it's not. It's a philosophical move, right? Okay, sorry. Lame joke. Okay, here we go. Here's the G.E. Moore shift. Notice we keep the same premise. Same first premise. We concede, if God star exists, boy, it's hard to see how God could have justifying reasons. How there could be evil for which God has no justifying reason. So if God star exists, we're going to say there's no gratuitous evil. This is the G.E. Moore shift. But second premise, here's the shift. Notice we took the conclusion where the existence of God is denied, and we're affirming the existence of God. Notice we've made what was a modus tollens into a what? Modus ponens, right? This is the even lamer joke that one man's modus tollens is another man's modus ponens. But anyway, you can sort of always respond with, for every modus tollens, you can respond with a modus ponens. Now, again, we're not just saying, hey, we're just going to claim this. We're going to say, we can actually argue for these premises, which gives us, by deductive validity, because it's the modus ponens, that there is no gratuitous evil. You see that? It's if P then Q, P therefore Q. Now, you might say, well, what's the argument? Well, again, premise one is conceded on both sides, so we really don't have to argue for that. We're saying, yeah, we're conceding that if God star exists, then there's no gratuitous evil. Now, how about premise two? Do we have reasons to believe that God star exists? And I want to say, yeah, a tremendous amount of evidence to say and reasons to think that God star exists. If we're just giving ourselves the apologetics, we've got the Kalam cosmological argument, we've got the Leibnizian cosmological argument, we've got the teleological argument, we've got the argument from fine-tuning, we've got the argument from consciousness, we've got the argument from religious experience, we've got the argument from the resurrection, we've got arguments upon arguments upon arguments, and they're not all coming to mind right now, to say that premise two is true, that God exists. But notice what follows from that in a deductively valid way is that there's no gratuitous evil. And somebody might say, well, how can you just deny that there's gratuitous evil? We're not. We're actually doing this in a very principled way. We're saying we've got really good reasons to believe that there's no gratuitous evil. What are those? Premise 1 and 2. That if there were, if that being exists, there is no gratuitous evil. This being exists, therefore, there's no gratuitous evil. That is our reasons for denying the existence of gratuitous evil. So that was a little bit of like philosophical sort of moves. That's why I say it's not a dance move, but it's a philosophical move here. But the idea is to say, look, and again, most of this is not what I would say in a counseling situation. But I do think that there's a pastoral point here. And the pastoral point is to say, we don't know. We honestly don't know. So that when somebody says, they're grieving, they're going through this tragedy, and they're saying, what? And they come to you and they say, why would God do this to me? Or why would God allow this? I think the right response is this response. I don't know. I don't know, and we may never know. We may be Job. Job never gets told an intellectually satisfying specific reason for why he suffered. Right? We know a bit more, having the book available, right? The prologue, but Job never does. Right? What is he told? He's given God in a way. He's saying God was there. God is there, right? And so that Job, who is he to sort of presume that he should know, all these sorts of things? Where was he at the foundation of the world? So on. And I think, again, pastorally and just, sort of devotionally for us, as we go through these experiences that throw us for a loop, honestly, I think the right response is just say, I don't know, and I may never know, but this I know. There is a God. There's a good God. There's a God that's in control. And there's a God that even has, right, because there's no gratuitous evil on the basis of this, God has justifying reasons. I just don't know what they are. And I don't need to know. I don't need to know in order to trust him, to follow him, and to give my life, to him.
I just feel like this wouldn't work very well on the street either.
Well, here's what it does. That's probably true. Most of this is not good marriage, like ammunition for marriage debates. Okay. Here's what this does, is it zeroes in on what do you think is more likely? Premise 2 of the original argument, there is gratuitous evil, or premise 2 of the new argument that we've given? What's more likely? Now again, on the street, somebody's probably going to say, I have no reason to think there's God, there's no evidence, blah, blah, blah. And I usually say, I think there's a dozen or more really solid arguments for the existence of God. And moreover, I've experienced God and ran into God and know God personally. Okay. So I've got a host of reasons to believe premise 2. What's your reasons for believing there's no gratuitous evil? Yeah, not you, but somebody on the street. I think they're going to be hard-pressed to come up with a single reason well, it just seems like there's gratuitous evil. I mean, how do you know it's gratuitous? In other words, that's the skeptical theist position, is to say you can't know. You're not in a position to know, right? Isn't it possible, we ask, that God has reasons for allowing what he's allowed, and we're just not in a position to know what those are? He's not told us. God under obligation to let us know every reason he has for everything? No. That's crazy. That's crazy to think he would always let us know exactly what his intentions are for everything that ever happens. See what I mean? And so I think what this really powerfully does, honestly, intellectually speaking, is sets it up to say, which one do you go with? That there's gratuitous evil, or that there's a God? And I find myself so satisfied in believing that there is a God, and I just don't know all the justifying reason for evil, pain and suffering that happens, rather than saying, oh, I think if there were reasons, we'd know about them, so therefore there's no God. You see what I mean? It seems like it's not even a fair fight at a certain point when if we just sort of like count up how many arguments there are for God's existence versus there is gratuitous evil, that wins, hands down, so to speak. Other questions on this? Because I do want you to see this point. I think this is really powerful, actually, for addressing intellectually what is, I think, a problem we should wrestle with to some degree. Because again, I can see why people look at the world and see it as godless, but when they begin to reflect on what reasons there are for God, and then say, so you're really sort of stuck between saying either I know that there's gratuitous evil, or I know that there's a God, and I don't know the reasons always. I find this far more satisfying.
Does it potentially force them to an irrational position if they reject modus tollens and therefore having premise 2?
Of which one, premise 2?
Of the first argument. If they deny, the GE more shift, you're presenting this modus tollens here. And so they deny that.
So the bottom one is modus ponens. Okay. That's okay.
So they deny the modus ponens.
Yes.
Say, we still don't believe that God exists, even though you're giving more evidence. Does that potentially force them to an irrational position to defend the original argument?
I think it's a much weaker argument compared to the modus ponens. So the modus tollens, I want to say, is, and should be recognized by everybody, as a weaker argument. But again, not everybody. William Rowe, as you'll read or have already, he's looking at both of these too and saying he finds the evidence so very compelling, given how much evil there is in the world, the great varieties of evil in the world, how we're kind of like, all you got to do is watch the news, and you're going to be a little bit blown away by the amount of pain and suffering. Almost every night. And so he's going to say, it seems like premise 2 of the modus tollens, problem of evil one, is much better evidenced than the modus ponens. And I just disagree, because for the reason that I don't know, and this is where we're faced. This is what we face, is that there's a lot of instances, maybe most instances, that we don't know God's reasons for allowing. But I still think we know God. I still think we have reasons to believe that God exists. So then I'm on good grounds in believing that there's no I said that very wrongly. I'm on good grounds to believe that there is no gratuitous evil here. And Rowe sets it up. He says that's the way you're going to have to go, is to say you've got such good reason to believe that God exists, therefore there's no gratuitous evil. But he thinks that's so implausible, to think that every instance of evil, especially throwing in it animal suffering and so on, natural animal suffering, by the way, not just at the hands of your rifle or whatever. Throwing all that into it, that God would have reasons for all of it. But I'm just exactly in the opposite position. I just say, man, I feel so satisfied by the compelling reasons I have for believing that God exists, God of a certain sort, God's star in particular, that I'm very satisfied in denying that there is such thing as gratuitous evil. So that's the back and forth. That's why I say, I think the second one wins, though I can get myself sort of in the shoes of somebody that's looking at the world, blown away time and time again, all the time, really, by how much pain and suffering and evil there is in the world. And on the basis of that, concluding there must not be a God. But the best we can, all we can do as knowers is look at, the evidence and see where it leads. And so that's where I say, I think walking through this, I think this is a very strong response, even though I can still see why somebody can't kind of get that out of their head, that there's just so much evil. It's so pervasive. So it makes me really, in a way, or at least trying to be, thoughtful towards them too. Just say, like, I get that, I see that, but look at these reasons to think that, and isn't it good grounds at least to believe that God does have justifying reasons, we're just not privy to them. It just seems like that's the way it should be when you start sort of reflecting on it in that way. All right. Now, I think we can go a step further. So this is kind of where most of the philosophical literature ends. I think, though, what I think about a lot in regards to this is to ask, why think God is obligated to prevent our suffering? Right? What we begin to see is that most people have this very sort of hedonistic view of God. That God's there to make our lives right, pleasure-filled. And that when we have pain, it's bad, it's wrong. Right? God can't do that. And I want to say, well, why think God has a kind of obligation, especially, to make our lives have less pain and suffering? Right? Why is that a moral evil? Now we bring something theological into it, I think. If suffering is part of our condemnation, right? If we are, so in other words, think about that original story that I told about the sitting by the pond and eating a sandwich. That would be a terrible, scene, a terrible place to eat a sandwich. But now imagine that it's a public execution by drowning, I guess. Right, somebody's being drowned because they have committed crimes, and they are being executed, sort of legally. If that was part of their condemnation, you wouldn't have an obligation to prevent it, reach out your hand and stop it, kind of thing, and moreover, you'd have an obligation to not, in a certain sense, because you're not in a position there, morally speaking, to prevent that kind of a thing, if that's part of our condemnation. So that is to say that if our pain and suffering is part of the sort of fallen world in which we live, then I don't think the evil that we see needs to have like specific, especially justifying reasons that God is like, out of the death of my mother-in-law, for example, that God's got to like save 4 people or 2 people to make it justifying. You know what I mean? Like, I don't think he has to have these outweighing reasons for every instance of pain and suffering there. It could just be part of the fallen world in which we live. And now I do think God has to have a sort of overarching justifying reasons for allowing the fallenness of the world. Does that make sense to you? But that we get in Christianity. We don't get that necessarily in other worldviews. I think we get that with the gospel. Right, that there is this sort of final hope, there is this final purpose in all of it, even if my stubbing my toe maybe doesn't have like a specific justifying reasons why God allowed that, or again my tragedy that I may experience or whatever. There may not be this sort of immediate, especially not immediate, justifying reason that God has for allowing that. And I think that's where we can get in a little bit of trouble when we start to say, look, the justifying reason for, the tsunami was whatever. That's where we'd be skeptical and say, we don't know, but I think ultimately what we say is God has a justifying reason for allowing the world to be fallen. And what is that? He's redeeming a people for himself. Right? What is that? That's the gospel. Now that, again, I think that's a uniquely Christian response to the problem of evil. One that I don't hear in the literature very often, if at all. But more importantly, it's one that I don't think other worldviews can give necessarily, right? Because most other religious views don't have fallenness, and they don't have a kind of, well, there's not redemption. There's not a gospel. I think of Islam. It's just having your good deeds outweigh your bad deeds. They might be able to give a free will defense, but they can't. Seemingly, at least I would suggest they can't give a justifying reason ultimately for God's allowing, or Allah allowing natural evil and tsunamis and such. But I think we can give given the gospel, that's our ultimate hope. That's the ultimate great good. In other words, I don't think, and this is what I think is a really important point about the gospel, is the gospel is not for our pleasure. Right? The gospel is not for our getting to experience heaven, or streets of gold and mansions, and that's how we often sell it. Right? It's sort of like, hey, look how good this is. Come on forward, right? But I think the true gospel the genuine gospel is just pointing us to the goodness and greatness of God, and the works and what He's done for us. Right? There was a point where I was just thinking about this a lot and really wrestling with these issues, and walked through the book of Acts to just look at the sort of ways in which the apostles and others, early Christians, gave the gospel. What were they emphasizing? And you never see, hey, look at the good stuff we get, streets of gold or whatever. It's always pointing us to God and what He's done for us. Right? The point is that it's not about us ultimately, in our own pleasures and satisfaction. Will we have pleasure and satisfaction? Absolutely. It's just not about that. Right? That's why I would not hold to a Christian hedonism, even though I know Piper's redefined that a couple of times along the way. That we probably do agree. I just think that term Christian hedonism is a bad idea. Again, I'm just throwing stuff out there that I'm not pursuing here much. But okay, here we go. I like Piper, by the way. His books have been instrumental in my life for sure. So we close this with, the sort of bookend of this is to say, despite our moral rebellion, though, despite the fact that God has no obligation to us in our enjoyment of life, our satisfaction and pleasure and so on, despite all that, God has provided for our redemption. That's our ultimate hope. And so if you haven't read Kreft yet, I think you'll like that. That's often students' one of their favorite readings, where he says, so what I want to say is the ultimate answer to all problems of evil is the work on the cross. Kreft says, and I'm told that's how you pronounce that, Kreft, not Kreeft, but anyway, Kreft says, how to get God off the hook? God's answer is Jesus. Jesus is not God off the hook, but God on the hook. In other words, God Himself entered into humanity to suffer, to experience pain and evil and so on our behalf. And I think that ultimately is the answer. Now, we might ask, this is my segue, so if anybody has a question, you want to ask this, but okay. My segue is, we might ask, why God does not make this possibility of redemption more obvious. Well, this brings us to the problem of divine hiddenness. We'll turn to that. Okay. And in some ways, the problem of hiddenness is just a problem of evil. I actually think it might be the other way around, but we'll talk about it. Here, okay, so we're talking about the problem of divine hiddenness now. This is turning from the problem of evil sort of officially to the problem of divine hiddenness, though a lot of things that, there'll be lots of things that are similar here. But here's what's claimed to be inconsistent, that God is all good and all powerful. But here's the problem. God's not obvious. He's certainly not as obvious as he could be, is the claim. And we can just sort of, seems like that shouldn't be making that particular noise unless someone or something is up there. Okay.
Hello?
Yeah. For those at home, there's odd noises coming from the vents. Okay. Added to that, we'll just push on here. God desires belief in him and punishes unbelief. This is all the claim. Again, we're going to take issue with some of this. So if God exists, he's a vindictive tease, which is really the goal here, of the argument, is to say that God doesn't exist, at least not an all-good, all-powerful God, right? Because he is not as obvious as he could be. More people could be saved, in effect, if God was more obvious. Right? There's kind of famous instance told of Bertrand Russell, who's kind of a famous atheist of previous generation. He's kind of the Richard Dawkins of the late 1950s or late 19th century, though he's far more thoughtful and he's a philosopher. So. But anyway, Russell was asked, as an atheist, what would you say if you're standing before God and God says, "Why didn't you believe?" And Russell's sort of famous answer, and you'll hear a lot of atheists say this, is not enough evidence. That God did not give enough evidence for belief. That the rational thing to do on the basis of the evidence was disbelief. And I've even heard atheists say things like, if there's a God, he's going to be pleased with me because I believed in accord with the evidence, or something to that effect. Okay. Here's stated in argument form or formalized. If God's star exists, then his existence is maximally obvious. And we just mean by that he's as obvious as he could possibly be. 2, God's star is not, basically it's saying he's not maximally obvious. He could make his existence more obvious. Now, why would you think 1? Well, the reasons for believing 1 is because, look, if there's an all-good God that's punishing disbelief, then God would want to make him, God would want to be as obvious as he could be. God should, if he could and he should, again, he's all good and all powerful, right, then we would, in a sense, expect him to be as obvious as he can be, but he's not as obvious as he could be, premise 2. Why think that? Well, now, a lot of you could be thinking, because oftentimes when I bring up the problem of divine hiddenness, people think, I think God is obvious. Well, the question is, could he be more obvious? Right? Could God, think about the ways in which God showed up for people in Scripture even. Moses is talking to a burning bush, after all. Right? It could be the case that as you walk down the sidewalk, every bush you walk by bursts into flames and God speaks to you. That would be possible for God. Very possible for God. He's capable of that. But it doesn't happen. He's not as obvious as he could be. Or think of Paul on the road to Damascus, right? He's blinded and Jesus verbally speaks to him and so on. That doesn't happen to many of us either. And I even think in my own life, I think of the ways in which God has quite graciously sort of revealed himself to me, right? And I think of others who just haven't had the experiences that I've had. That suggests, is plausible at least, that God could be more obvious than he is. Because again, it's not, we might say God is very, very obvious, but so long as he could be more obvious than he is, then 2 goes through. It follows from this, again, by deductive validity, that God star does not exist. All right, let's think about this a little bit. Everybody see the problem? See the argument? So it's in effect saying, if God star exists, and his existence is maximally obvious, his existence is not maximally obvious, modus tollens, therefore God does not exist. Okay. Let's first ask this question, sort of pushing back on premise. I'm going to push back on both these premises. I'm not sure exactly which one I'm denying, but I'm denying one of these. Premise 1, we ask, must God be maximally obvious? Like, why think that God is obligated again to be more obvious than he is? Because I want to say, again, this is something of a theological point, that I don't think now, hear me out here, because some of you will be quick to disagree with this, but I don't think that our condemnation is from a mere lack of belief. Right? Sometimes and what I want to say is our condemnation is because of our moral rebellion. Okay. Now, I don't, Romans 1 makes clear that, people are aware of God and they're thereby without excuse and so on. Like I believe all that, of course. But again, the reason why even those people are condemned is because of what they do, not merely because they didn't believe. See what I mean? Sometimes our lack of belief is a moral choice we make, something we do. But I don't think it's the mere lack of belief that makes for our condemnation. Does that make sense to you? Our condemnation is because we do things that we know we shouldn't do. We sin, in fact. We're sinners. We do sin. So that a person, I just deny this claim that a person is going to hell because they don't believe. Instead, I think people go to hell are under condemnation because of the immoral things that they do, because of the sin in their lives, and so on. Now, I think that the moral law has to be thereby morally obvious. But it is, right? I think it is. I think everybody knows what they should and shouldn't do to some extent or other, and they choose to do what they shouldn't do. I don't find too many people these days, I think especially this is one aspect of a kind of millennial Gen Y generation, the younger generations. They're very aware of their fallenness. They're very quick to say, yeah, I'm really imperfect. I just don't, it's kind of like my parents, which is kind of the baby boomer generation, that had the audacity to say that they, were basically good people and that they sort of deserve. Yeah, I find that the younger the generation, the more, in a way, aware. I mean, it's probably just they've seen so many people fall from grace and people that they had respect for, do these terrible things or whatever. But they seem to be very quick to admit their sin. And so, how do they know they sinned? Well, it's because they know what they ought to do in certain circumstances and they don't do it. And me too, right? Me too. I know what I ought to do and I often don't do it. So my claim is that we've chosen rebellion against God. And again, I want to ask, why would God be obligated to save us? Why would God be obligated? If we've chosen moral rebellion against God, why would God be obligated to be more obvious to us and provide more evidence for us and provide these fantastic events for us? See what I mean? So in a way, I don't know if I want to go back to it because sometimes it's hard to get back to it. But first slide that I had up on the hiddenness stuff, when I said God punishes lack of belief, I want to say not so. I don't think God punishes lack of belief. I think God punishes our sin. And again, sometimes our lack of belief might be a kind of sinful thing. But I don't know that it's in the moral category. Belief or lack of belief. In other words, I don't think I've done anything morally right when I believe in God. I think I thereby earn God's favor doing something righteous. But I don't think it's in the category of being righteous or unrighteous. I think it's our sin. It's when we don't do what we know we ought to do and so on. Okay, so am I denying premise one? Yeah, I think so.
Doesn't the Bible speak of believing in Jesus as a moral ought? Like my son, believe in him.
Yeah, I think so. Though a lot of times the distinction is made between believing in and believing that. So believing that is just the mere kind of intellectual assent to Jesus. And, you know, that's where, again, I think that a lot of folks in our churches intellectually, you know, they believe these things. They don't have intellectual problems. They have moral problems. They've never believed in. That is to say, they've never placed their faith in. They never trusted or made, you know, sort of Christ Lord of their lives in some ways. So the believe in does involve a kind of moral decision. But the mere kind of like, because remember what we're talking about when the hiddenness thing is evidence to believe that. Could God be more obvious? I'm going to concede, yeah, in a sense he could, but I don't think he has to be. I don't think he's morally obligated to be. I think so long as the moral law is obvious, which it is, again, this is Romans, it's written on our hearts. You know, moral law is written on our hearts. I think everyone, no matter what tribe or country or, you know, civilized city or whatever, it doesn't matter, they have an awareness of what they should and shouldn't do, and we all choose to sin at times. So believe in, I want to say, yeah, is moral. But believe that, I want to say, is epistemological. And thereby, for me, that wouldn't be, that my own view would be that say that it's not moral. Now, there's certain, okay, again, there's, you know, and I think what Paul's doing in Romans 1 in some ways is saying whether or not somebody can say, look, I didn't know God exists, in order to say they had an excuse. And I think when you take the argument that Paul develops through, you know, especially Romans 3, 1 through 3, the broad sweep is to say, one, you don't have the excuse because you didn't know that God exists. Why? Because you did know that you had awareness of God's existence and so on. Two, we all sin. We all do what we do, you know, shouldn't do and so on, and that we're condemned on the basis of that. So we don't have that excuse, but we also, in fact, sin. And Jew, Gentile, everybody is under condemnation for their sin, for doing what they should.
So would a good analogy be that we have to pay the fine? Obviously, it helps worse than fine.
Yeah.
Legal sense. You
Yeah.
have to pay a fine for something you did wrong. But God being the judge, who also gave that fine, and also comes off with revenge.
Yeah, I think that's ultimately what we say, of course, with the gospel. Trying to fit that example into the hiddenness stuff. So one thing to say is, look, you might not know the author of, say, a traffic law. That author is hidden to you in a certain sense. But we know we should, when there's a sign especially, we should obey the traffic laws. And so that when we violate that law, you know, we have the consequence as a result of it. And I think that's our setting, that's our situation, that's our context, is that we all have an awareness of the law. It's written on our hearts, in fact. And we all break it, and knowingly break it, freely, on my view, freely break it. And thereby we're morally responsible for that. We're condemned on the basis of that. so that God doesn't have to make himself, he just doesn't have any obligation to make himself obvious, because the punishment that we'll receive is not on the basis of our belief or lack of belief. It's in him. It's for our moral rebellion against the moral law. That's the sort of picture I'm trying to paint. Okay. I also want to question premise one on the basis of this, as we ask, what would it look like for God to be maximally obvious? Like, what do we want there? And I think we can, sorry, that text is a little small. Hopefully you can read that. We can imagine God making himself obvious in certain ways, burning bushes and, on the road to Damascus and things. But I think a lot of those ways would not, the fantastic ways, right, wouldn't actually accomplish what we think that they would accomplish. I don't know. I mean, that it's the case that if Richard Dawkins were to have, as a famous atheist, if he were to have, God talk to him through a burning bush, he would bow down and worship him and follow him. I just don't know that that's very plausible to think that that's true. I have heard, I think I've mentioned this maybe, but one famous atheist was asked, what if Jesus Christ himself appeared to you? Would you believe that? And he said, no, I would check myself into a mental hospital. Because I'm hearing things, I'm seeing things. That heart is hardened, I think it's safe to suggest. Right? That heart, it almost wouldn't matter what God did in terms of the fantastic to get a hold of him or her. And I think that's a lot of people. It almost wouldn't matter what was done. You say Pharaoh? Yeah. Right. Right. I mean, and I think I say this here in a minute on the slide, but there's lots of biblical examples. I mean, the nation of Israel themselves, right, had seen these incredible, fantastic miracles, works of God, and yet, they turned to idol worship and things. Even in the New Testament, this is what I'm going to say here in a minute. Sorry? Yeah, Lazarus, yeah. I think I have this coming up in the next slide. But so we want to say, if premise one is true at all, it's going to be only true in the ways that are consistent with God's plans and purposes. In other words, God's not obligated to be fantastic and mesmerizing in ways that don't fulfill his plans and purposes. You're going to read Mike Ray's article on this to say, I think we need to approach God and say God gets to be obvious in the ways in which are consistent with his character and what he's after here. He's not after mere intellectual belief. I think that's a game changer for your faith, if that's not already clear. He's not after mere intellectual belief. Again, we've got Baptist churches filled with intellectual believers. They just have never given their lives to Christ. That's why they show up on Christmas and Easter, right? They believe in the resurrection and the virgin birth, etc. They just have never given their lives to Christ. So God's not after that. And of course, moreover, and I think I say this here in a minute, but the demons believe, right? They have their intellectual selves in good shape. It's not the intellect that's the problem. It's a moral problem. So I think we want to say about premise 2, yes, God could do more of the fantastic, but we want to question whether or not it would be good if he did, whether or not it would fit his plans and his purposes. It's plausible, I want to say, that God is maximally obvious in the ways that are consistent with his plans and his purposes. So let me try to make that point. I might be willing to say premise 2 is false if we're saying, right, but I would be saying that God is maximally obvious in a way that accomplishes what he's after. If he was after mere intellectual belief, then yeah, he could be more fantastic, but I don't think he's after mere intellectual belief.
serve the purpose, though, what would be more fantastic? Because, I mean, his incarnation, Jesus' incarnation, the resurrection, all the exaltation, all of that is fantastic. And all of that, to me, is factually obvious. And what I wrestle with here is, like, what is the position, and there may not be, what is the position that I like to look in 2 Corinthians 4:4, which says the God of this world has blinded the truth of the gospel. So we know that unbelievers can't perceive as we perceive, like what's factually obvious to us is not to them, nor will it ever be into the Holy Spirit. So, I mean, I guess, to me, the whole argument is a little off because of what the word says, that there is a maximum object God in this world, working in this world, yet, atheists, they won't see it. They'll never see it. They're blind.
Yeah, and I think, so the point here is to say, even if God did do more of the fantastic, would it accomplish his purposes? Right? So maybe Bertrand Russell would have believed if there was more evidence, but the demons believe. Right? So would he have given his life, submitted, and if you know the life of Bertrand Russell at all, it's pretty clear, a very hardened heart, and lived his sort of celebrity lifestyle and so on as a scholar. And many, many others. I mean, you look at a lot of these atheists, it's pretty clear they have a way of life that they like. They like that. They like that. And even if God were to show up in some way, I'm not sure that they would be willing to jettison their lifestyle. Yes, please. Yes.
So, don't say believing, but giving our life to Christ that affects our behavior, right?
Yeah.
Our actions. That would be good if giving our life to Christ based on miracles and fantastic things or prosperity would be good. That's my first question.
Oh, could it be good? I think it can be. I mean, that's where we see examples like Paul, who goes from being persecutor, because again, and of course, in his life, this is this struggle that he's the chief of sinners, the things that he's done in his life were this dark stain on his life, and I think he grappled with that to some degree, and yet he was doing it with a kind of fanaticism, but he thought he was doing the right thing. I mean, I think he was really thinking that he was serving God in a way, right? And so this fantastic event happens, namely the road to Damascus experience for him, and flips him 180 degrees, and he becomes, the apostle that we know of. And so there's an experience, I think, that was pretty crazy, pretty, incredible, and people believe. And there were people that I think followed Christ on the basis of the miracles that they saw and the healings and these more fantastic things. But I don't know, and this is the point I'm going to make here in a minute, is that those were always, I hate to say it this way, but it's almost like those weren't always very effective. Because what they did, they were great at drawing a crowd together. But the minute he started talking about discipleship, they take off, right? When they start to realize what this means. And that's why I say I think Bertrand Russell, I get the sense, and of course I don't know I don't know what his heart was like or where he was at specifically, but I get the sense that a lot of these guys, maybe they would believe perhaps, but I just don't know that their hearts are such that they would commit them. In other words, I think what people often wanted was more tricks. They wanted Jesus to do more tricks. It was like a parlor trick at a certain point.
And would that be faith? Because the gospel says the salvation is based by faith.
Mhm.
Would that be faith? And the second question is the same, like knowing all the arguments, rational.
Yeah.
Would be that faith too if I not believing in God, I give my life to God based because I certain the rational argument will be that faith too.
Yeah, I see. I think that's where I think that apologetics has a limited value, and that's it's not good job security for me, but since I do apologetics, but I think it does have limited value in the sense that what we're primarily doing in apologetics is addressing a person's intellectual selves, right? Their beliefs and coming to see reasons. Now, I think it's perfectly possible that on the basis of apologetics, somebody comes to believe that Christianity is true and yet not yield themselves to Christ and not have faith. I think that's perfectly possible, and that's a danger. I think that's a true danger of doing apologetics, is that all we ever address in a person is their intellectual selves. Whereas I think we need to, that's why I think in this pre-evangelistic mode, we need to be addressing objections and giving positive reasons, intellectually speaking, and so on, but get to the gospel. And we've got to be evangelists at a certain point to prevent that from happening. Okay, so I think it's of a real value because, again, I know a lot of people that there was just a kind of roadblock for them, intellectually speaking. They just couldn't see how these two pieces fit together, and once they saw that, they were ready to hear the gospel in a way. And so I think what happened with Paul, again, just my sort of speculation here, is that Paul makes a 180, certainly in part because, boom, there's this crazy experience on the road to Damascus, but ultimately he yields his life and heart to Jesus, right? So it's like that, in a way, provided evidence, solved the intellectual problem of what he should do in light of, what does God want him to do? And it's not persecute Jesus and kill Christians and so on. That solved that intellectual problem, but ultimately that wasn't his only problem. It was a moral problem, and I think that's where we all find ourselves. So I think it has value, but it's a limited value, and I think we have to, again, when it comes to unbelievers, get to the gospel. And then also, that's where I want to say a lot of its value is going to be for people who have come to Christ, want to follow Christ, have yielded their lives to Christ some way or another, but have questions. It's a way to be built up in the Lord, to have greater and this sure sort of confidence, and just to frankly know God in this deeper way. Because I think, that's why I think looking at these objections, actually I was making this point in another class that meets in here, so I get confused. But I was going to say, like I was saying the other day, it wasn't you guys though, right? Looking at objections can so often be very powerful for us, like as I keep using the word pastoral, but by being able to sort of put ourselves in the shoes of somebody who's making the objection, not because we're on the precipice of walking away. I don't know that any of you are there, that you're like really, truly struggling with doubts, and if you can't get these figured out, you're out. You're going to walk away. I don't think probably most of us are there, if any. What I think, though, is still a huge value for us is to look at these objections, these powerful objections, in fact. These do cause people to walk away, or at least have, or at least have been instrumental in people walking away. And when we see what we can say to address these and sort of, size them up a bit and try to address them, then it's this, we're brought to a greater place of confidence. I think there's a real value in that. Did I answer? Okay. Yeah.
I don't think we truly define maximally obvious.
Okay.
Because to me, that would be like what Adam and Eve experienced. be like.
Well, see, what I'm saying is I think we can think of maximally obvious as what would accomplish God's goals. What would best accomplish God's goals? So that if God were to be more obvious, in other words, this is the point about belief, I think it would only address the belief issue, right? It wouldn't address the moral issue, the sort of faith issue. Because again, I think what we see, I keep trying to get here, but Jesus' miracles, right? When he did miracles, he got crowds, and probably a lot of people believed that. But a lot of them didn't believe in. A lot of them didn't place their faith, right? A lot of them, as soon as the miracle stopped and he starts talking about the cost of discipleship, taking up your cross, and et cetera, and these other things, they're out. And this happens throughout the Gospels, that the crowds depart, even to the sadness of Jesus. He expresses sadness at the fact that they're leaving. And I love that passage. It's John. I don't remember the exact passage. Unless I wrote it down here now. Where Jesus says to the disciples, "Are you going to leave too?" And they, in effect, say, "Where would we go? You've got the words of life." And that's where I find myself so often, is that it's sort of like, I don't know what to think about all this. I don't know that I've got it all figured out, certainly. But where else am I going to go? I mean, this is life. This is where it's at. This is this is the truth. So I think that often it was the case that Jesus' miracles become more about doing more tricks. Right? We want more tricks. We want the performance. We want the entertainment, and not actually. Right, and we even see, I have a note here, we even see Matthew 13, where he doesn't do miracles because of their unbelief. Right? He pulls back from that because of their unbelief. You would think he would do more miracles because of unbelief, but not if, if that wasn't his goal, just to get the crowds, get people following him and so on. Now, again, I want to say, we do see a place where we see large numbers of people coming to faith, not just intellectual belief, but to faith. And where do we see that? Acts, right? We see that with what? Not necessarily. I mean, there's miracles in Acts too, but it's the preaching of the word and the conviction of the hearts. When there's conviction of the hearts and so on, that's when we see thousands of people coming to Christ. Thousands upon thousands. And I think that's a really interesting and important point. So again, it's not to, say the miracles weren't important to all this, but it's a repentant heart. Without that, the miracles seem to become all about us. There was kind of an important moment for me too. I led the mission trip, this a few years ago now, to Mexico. So we had a team of like 15 students, something like that, to Mexico. And one of the guys on the trip had the body to be a offensive lineman, probably, or something, of a football, professional football team. Big dude, just tall, like big guy. So he literally didn't sit with us because they put him in the exit row because he's a big guy. Anyway, that has nothing to do with it. But anyway, but I was told at some point in the flight, so during our flight, 30,000 feet in the air, I was told that he's having an issue, and the word that was used was heart attack. And we're 30,000 right, en route to Mexico for a mission trip. So we're praying, of course. They're talking about what they do. They turn around, this kind of thing. Just so happy. Oh, and so we're praying for him. One of the guys on the team, I'm confident now that he's not Baptist. He was Pentecostal or something, because he's like standing, because there's a little space there in front of him on the exit row where he's like pulling the demons out. I don't know what he's all doing, but it's like, I mean, he's going for it. He thought it was life or death, which it seemed to be. And of course, the rest of us are praying, this sort of thing. That's right. So, just so happens there's a doctor on board. and a very accomplished doctor at that. And he goes over to him, is treating him. They give him, I always forget the name of this. It's not nitrous, right? That's something else. Yeah, it was something that like settled him down, and anyway, they give him, yeah, not aspirin, but something to that. Yeah, medicine of some sort. Such that when we landed, he's fine. And we get off. I go with him into an ambulance. Best way to do customs, by the way, at the back of an ambulance. Just lickety split. We get in the back of an ambulance and go straight to the hospital. Doctor looks him over, does various tests, and says, "There's not a sign at all that you've had any issue. You are 100%. I can't see that you've even had a problem." And so we go join the team. Do the trip. Has no issues. Has never, so far as I know, ever had an issue since. And so we were talking about later that in the trip, just saying, was that a miracle? Right? Did we just experience a miracle? And, the options are, well, was it our prayers? Was it our Pentecostal brother that's, doing all kinds of crazy things? Or was it the doctor? And I kind of think it doesn't matter, right? I think we want miraculous stories to sort of, especially come home and sort of brag about it and talk about it. But here's the thing, with a Christian worldview, God should receive praise no matter if it was a miraculous supernatural event or it was the doctor's medicine and his treatment of him. Right? We should equally return thanks and praise and credit to him. Doesn't matter if it was a miracle or not. I do often think that we want miracles because we want special effects, right? We want the fantastic. But is that coming from a good place in our hearts, or is that more of a bragging thing, kind of we want it for ourselves, not necessarily to bring glory and thanks and praise to God? Mm-hmm. What do you think? We got a few. Any thoughts on that?
I think it goes back to your first lecture of the emotionalism.
Yeah, I agree.
As opposed to Christianity being a rational thinking religion. I think that plays a lot into the desire for supernatural things.
Yeah. Yeah, so this is something we'll talk about when we'll spend a week talking about miracles, but or spend a session on that. I think we want to be just careful with what we call a miracle, right? And getting that parking spot right up near the front on Easter Sunday morning, probably not a miracle, right? I think we often don't know. It depends on your church. Yeah, depends, but no. I think we often don't know whether or not something was a miracle, but it doesn't matter. Right? We don't need that. We shouldn't need that, it seems to me, to give praise and thanks to God and so on. And to see God as intimately related in the happenings of our lives. Now, one last point before we go, and this is I know a Scott Ray and a Mike Ray, but this is Mike Ray, makes the point in what you'll read is that his silence, he makes the point that sometimes it's construed in terms of God's silence, right? He's not being as loud as we kind of want him to be. And I think that need not be understood as God's absence, right? Sometimes, as he says, the lack of verbiage is a louder voice of his love. And we need not experience his silence as absence. We will definitely experience times like that where it seems like our prayers are hitting the ceiling kind of thing, and we just don't feel like God's very near. Well, the reality is, what are you basing that off of? And I think oftentimes, and this is a challenge I had early on, is that in those times in which it feels like God is not near, those are the times to press in, because God's up to something in our lives, right? He's drawing us in, at almost as a lover, that's saying, "Come on," that's saying, "Come follow." So I think sometimes that sort of hiddenness is for a deeper relationship, right? That kind of silence is a call to us to sort of dig in, to lean into the Lord. So anyway, all right. And I should probably finish that better, but